recorded, and it'll be available for on-demand viewing on SHPO's conference pages. As we begin, we want to recognize that Minnesota history spans at least 13,000 years. Most of that time is represented by American Indian history alone. And from that perspective, our urban and rural built environments are very recent. The state of Minnesota, as it's been known since 1858, is within the ancestral homelands of the Dakota and Ojibwe peoples. The 11 tribal nations in Minnesota are our partners in advocating for recognition and protection of the state's cultural resources, along with other Native nations with historical connections here. One of the ways to recognize cultural resources is through development of historic contexts, which our presenters will tell us about today. We've set aside time at the end of the session for Q&A, and we'll get to questions as time allows. To ask a question, please use the Q&A function rather than the chat function. And now I'd like to introduce our presenters. Crystal Boyd is president of Crystal Boyd Consulting. Ginny Way is the National Register Architectural Historian at the Minnesota SHPO. Carolyn Veeser-Egbide leads the Heritage Preservation's Grants Office at the Minnesota Historical Society. Teresa Martin, formerly an archaeologist with the Minnesota Department of Transportation, now volunteers at the Golden Valley Historical Society. Lucky them. And Tom Zahn is president of Thomas R. Zahn and Associates. If you'd like to learn more about the presenters' professional backgrounds, you can find their detailed bios and contact information on the Minnesota SHPO conference homepage. And with that, I'll turn it over to Crystal Boyd, who will start the presentation.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for that great introduction. And thank you to everyone for being here today and joining us to talk about historic context studies. So I'm pulling up our presentation now. And like we mentioned, we have a two-part presentation today. It's a panel, so each of us will speak for about 10 minutes. And the first part will be about historic context studies, almost a 101 session. And then we'll do a Q&A. So if you have questions, we can address those right in the middle of the presentation. And the second half will be a case study. This is about a historic context study that was done by the Golden Valley Historical Society and was a real collaboration among all of the people we'll see speaking today. So for our agenda, we've got those two pieces. We'll do the definition, scope, and overview of a historic context study, and also hear about some legacy amendment grant guidance. If you're doing a historic context study and seeking those funds from the legacy amendment, Carolyn will have some great advice for us. Again, we'll do that Q&A, so start typing your questions into the chat as we go. And in the second half, we'll talk about where the Golden Valley project came from, how it got started, how it was implemented, and what has happened since the project wrapped up. So those are the two sections, and we'll have more Q&A at the end. Again, a huge thank you to all of our presenters. The 5 of us have worked together closely to make sure we got a really quality result. And so each of us will present from our unique, special perspectives. And our first presenter is Ginny to talk about the definition, the scope, and overview of historic context studies. So Ginny, if you would like to introduce yourself and take it away, we're excited to hear your presentation.
Hi, y'all. My name is Ginny Way. I'm the National Register Architectural Historian for the State Historic Preservation Office. Along with my colleagues, I am responsible for reviewing context documents when they come through the office. It is a great pleasure to be here and to speak to you about these important foundational documents. Again, as Leslie mentioned, my contact information is available on the SHPO website. If you have any questions that arise that I can help you with, please reach out. So as Crystal mentioned, we're going to do kind of a 101. 10 minutes is brief to go through the entirety of complexities of contexts. So we're going to keep it really high level. So one of the things that we need to understand about a historic context is that they are a preservation planning document. So unlike a city history or other general history documents, these are intended to be part of a process that ultimately concludes with the evaluation, registration, and treatment of historic properties. So it is one of the most foundational steps in a preservation planning goal. Crystal, next slide. So notice here that context and theme studies are considered part of the identification phase. So this is the work we do prior to going out and surveying. You will notice that a recon survey, so the act of going and putting boots on the ground and looking at properties, is separate in identification. So the National Park Service kind of groups identification as everything happening before evaluation. It's sort of a pre-planning document, something that you need before you can evaluate, but it is not a survey. So that's one of the fundamental things to understand about a context. It gathers history and, as we will talk about in a little bit, creates a framework for analysis of both integrity and criteria for themes of significance, but it is not a survey. We do not actually anticipate that most contexts will have a part of them that includes walking around and actually photographing large numbers of buildings. Next slide, please. So the National Park Service defines a context as an organizational framework that groups information about related historic properties based on theme, geographical area, and period of time. They're guided by specific research questions, and this is often the hardest part for an applicant or a project proprietor to understand, is that you really have to come into a context with a specific goal in mind. What is it that you're trying to understand and eventually identify? A broad question or a narrow question, both are acceptable. Both are interesting scopes of work and can be handled, but clearly a broad question will be more expensive to tackle than a narrow. We'll get into the major types here in a minute. Things that you should think about when you're developing your scope, when you're thinking about your context, are your geographical region. Are you looking at your city? Are you just looking at your downtown? Are you looking at a township? Your theme, are you only interested in railroad related properties? Are you interested in all modernism? Are you interested in something specific like schools? We'll get to that in just a second. And then your time period. Are you interested in only early agricultural pieces, or are you interested in commercial understanding within your community throughout time? One of the things that's really important to understand about contexts with regard to preservation planning is they will provide for you a framework for assessing properties within them. So a historical document that has a history of your town, even if it's it's just the history of your schools or it's an entire history of your community, is just a history document if it doesn't include registration guidelines or guidelines to help you identify the integrity of a property. The point of these contexts as part of a preservation plan is to help you eventually analyze, identify, and evaluate these properties. So you can't have those guidelines without a well-understood scope. So the primary function is to provide that framework for the preservation planning process. And in order to do that, we really need to understand how a context is applicable to each individual property. Next, please. So there is National Park Service guidelines. We should understand that as a preservation planning document, the State Historic Preservation Office and Minnesota Historical Society, the National Park Service are working under established guidelines in order to determine whether or not a particular document meets the required standards. Those primary documents are the National Register Bulletin 24 and the National Park Service White Paper, the components of a historic context. The SHPO History and Architecture Survey Manual also has reference to contexts, but as you're discussing your scope and trying to figure out what exactly you're going to approach when it comes to a context, these are the two documents that we are going to be using to assess whether or not that document, your context document, is effective. I should also mention, and should have mentioned earlier, sorry, we are talking specifically about standalone context documents. So those broad documents meant as foundational a foundational understanding of a theme, not the pieces of context that go into a National Register listing or things like that. Next slide, please. So there are two basic types of contextual documents that your project will probably fall under. The first is a property type. So this tends to be what we think about. We tend to understand architectural properties specifically as sort of being grouped by these themes. So in this case, this is the St. Paul Public Schools. You can see that there's a geographic limit. It is St. Paul. It is not Minneapolis. It is not suburbs. 1890 to 1978. That is a temporal limit. So we are not looking at one-room schoolhouses. We are not looking at new construction from last year. And you can see, maybe you can't see depending on the size of your screen, I've included here a snapshot of the table of contents so that you can understand all of the work that goes into creating this context. So when we think about a property type context, we think, oh, well, schools, well, we can go out and find those, right? We could Google it and all of the St. Paul Public Schools would come up. But within this context, it also discusses the teacher strikes. It discusses desegregation. It discusses schools that were built as schools but have been used as something else for long periods of time. It discussed properties that were built as something else but utilized by schools. So it's not always, even with a property type context, it's not always easy to understand the full context of a property simply by finding something that seems to fit into the theme. Next slide, please. One of the things a property type context will be able to provide that some of the broader ones will not is a general understanding of where those buildings are. So the St. Paul Public School System had on hand a list of addresses of properties and when they were built. Now, to differentiate this from a survey, the context did not go out and look at each of those buildings. However, they were able to provide them for us so that the next step in identification, someone would easily be able to locate them geographically within the city. So while the property type context will sometimes include specific buildings, again, we're not surveying those. We're not expecting the consultant to go out and take a look at those and develop integrity, analysis for integrity. So next slide, please. So these were photographs that were included in that context. You can see that they are all historic. So they were found within the historical record and while doing research. These are used to provide a discussion, to illustrate a discussion about what a property would look like. So one of the things that, as we said, a context needs to do is it needs to help you be able to compare properties so that when you do go out and look at a 1957 school, you're not confused that it's 1886, even if you know nothing about architecture. Or if you go out to an 1886 school and you know it was early, but there's this low slung 2-story addition, you can say to yourself, oh, the context told me that schools looked like this in the post-war period. So perhaps this is a school that illustrates both periods as opposed to just the early or just the late. Next slide, please. So the other one is place-based, and this was what Golden Valley was, and this is what we're seeing a lot of coming through the Legacy Grants program. And I understand people want all the things all the time. They want to say, this is my community, and I want to know everything about a community, and that is okay. I will do that all day long. I think that that is awesome. It probably is going to cost more than $10,000 though. So when you're thinking about your place-based, you can see here in the table of contents what this successful context went over. It provides multiple themes for the development of a place. It provides registration requirements or registration guidelines and integrity guidelines for each of the resource types within that. So remember that you're going to have to, because this is a preservation planning document, you're going to drill really deep into each of those pieces, each of those themes, in order to have an effective planning document. So this was from the city of, Venica. I'm not going to be able to say it because it's Californian. I haven't studied Western pronunciation. But this was the entire city. And that's what they decided that they wanted to do. They wanted a contextual understanding of the entire city. Can you go to the next slide, please? So in this case, they did provide, as you can see here, there are property types and registration requirements. There are general overviews based on transportation and immigration and architectural style. They also provided representative photographs, which is helpful if you have an architectural context. And then they provided those registration requirements and an understanding of how to compare those buildings. So unlike St. Paul Public Schools, where you know it's a school, and because it's a school, it's likely potentially going to be significant, you can whittle down, right? You have to compare those schools. With place-based context, you may have 100 early 20th century commercial buildings. How on earth do you decide which of those is, contextually significant? Which of those should go on to evaluation? Well, the context will give you that. It will give you some guidelines on how to compare those documents so that you can better understand where to focus your resources in your next steps. One more slide, please. I think that's it for me. Again, I encourage you, if you're concerned about your scope, your phasing, how much something is going to cost, please contact me before you speak to Carolyn, and we can try to narrow something down. As Tom will talk about later, I don't understand the money. I just deal with the regulations. So I am learning exactly what things costs, but we can certainly work together to try to come up with a scope that fulfills your needs. Thanks, Crystal.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Ginny. That was a wonderful overview. In just 10 minutes, you fit in a lot of great information, so thank you.
You're welcome.
Like you mentioned, now we'll turn to the money piece. So Carolyn, please tell us a little bit about the Legacy Amendment Funds.
Well, thanks, Crystal, and thank you, Ginny, for your great presentation so far. So I have a high bar to live up to right now. So thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Again, my name is Carolyn Veeser-Egbide. I am the grants manager with the Minnesota Historical Society. And a couple fun facts for you today. MNHS has been administering grants since early 1970s. So we've been around the block for a couple times with the grant program. And I am a lifelong Minnesotan, so all about Minnesota. So for my part of the panel, I'm sharing info on my favorite subject, money. So next slide. Hey, did you hear what you can get a grant for that? Yeah, you can get a grant for that. So MNHS has funds available for historic preservation planning projects, including all Ginny talked about today with the development of a context study. Next. Wait a minute, Carolyn. I mean, I'm hooked, but what's the catch? Okay, you got us. We do have some expectations and what we refer to as requirements for the grant program. And the first one being is that you have to meet professional standards when developing the context study. And on the screen, you will see the standards for the historic preservation planning projects that are applicable to the project that you're asking us to fund. And with that, I would just say that, don't worry if you're not intimately familiar with these with these standards. The consultant that you hire will be able to apply them in the development of the context study. We would always encourage you to be familiar with them, so it doesn't hurt to read through them on your own just so that you're familiar with those standards. Okay, next. Okay, a grantee is responsible for hiring those that they want to work on the project, but we do expect that the person hired meets the Secretary of Interior standards for professional qualification standards. I know that wasn't the right way to say it, so let me repeat that. They just need to meet the SOI professional qualification standards. And usually, typically, and Ginny can correct me if I'm wrong, we usually see an architectural historian hired for these type of projects. Ginny's not showing in, so.
No, or a historian.
I'm sorry, was that?
Above,
or a historian.
For above ground structures, if you're doing something that includes archaeology, please be interdisciplinary and hire an archaeologist as well.
Great, thank you. Okay, the next one. Finally, and I think, and Ginny touched base on this already, but I just remind you finally, just be aware of the time you need to complete the work. 12 months is a normal granting period for us for our project, and also the amount needed. So it is acceptable, and we've seen this happen a couple of times in the grant program where context studies are broken down into what we refer to as phases, but I would think that Ginny would refer to them as a theme or a geographical area. And yes, so you can break them down into phases, but just keep in mind that they have to be a completed final product at the end. So Carolyn, what's the name of that wonderful grant source, you may ask? Well, it is the Minnesota Historical Heritage and Cultural Grant Program, often referred to as the Legacy Grants. This is a competitive grant program and has been funding projects like context studies since 2009 and is offered statewide. So thank you, Minnesotans. It's a wonderful gift to all of us. Next. Just as a reminder, the grant program accepts application from the 4 entities on your screen through our online grant portal. Okay, next. The grant program accepts applications for requests of $10,000 or less 4 times a year. And we do that in January, April, July, and October are the application deadlines. And then once a year for requests of more than $10,000. We have seen context studies in both as a small request and as a large request. And it's up to you to decide how you're going to request a context study, whether you're going to go for the large or whether you're going to go for the small. Okay, next. Okay, some fun facts on the screen for you. Enjoy. Keep in mind that this grant program does not require a match. However, we do encourage it, and it demonstrates commitment to the work along with other reasons. And these would be the conversations to have with our office if you're curious about what the other reasons would be for the match. So there is money available for your context study. Don't be shy. Come apply. Next. This is my last slide. Aw, don't worry, I'll hang around. We are your biggest supporters and enjoy connecting with you. We are knowledgeable about the grant program, the grant requirements, and subject experts. And when I say we, I include my SHPO colleagues. They are familiar with the grant program. They are your subject experts. We all enjoy helping you get the dollars and get that context study done. Don't be afraid to reach out to us. We're here to help as well. So these are some great resources for you. And that is all for me.
Excellent. This is so fantastic. You ladies are both amazing resources. So thank you for the information that you've shared. I'll leave this on the screen for a little bit if folks want to jot down these resources, but we're going to shift into our question and answer mid-session. So I do have a question that might help us get kicked off, and then our moderator might come in with a few more. But you two are such a great team. Could you talk a little bit about the relationship between the Grants Office and SHPO and how they work together on things like milestones? Would that be a good place to start?
Sure. Yeah. Ginny, do you want me to start or would you like to go?
No, you take away.
Well, we had the privilege of having the State Historic Preservation Office at MNHS for a long time. And then they moved to the Department of Admin. So I think that relationship has been long lasting because we were all housed in the same office, and we've continued kind of that understanding of each other as really close and colleagues. And that gave us all an understanding of the grant program together. So when they moved, they took that knowledge with them, and we're so grateful of that they have that more intimate knowledge of the grant program. And they still coordinate with us around subject expertise. So they help us provide expertise when reviewing applications for preservation planning projects. And so they are still involved in the grant program in that way. So they would review an application for us if we ask, and then if it's funded, they review the reports that go along with it. So you're getting that direct expertise from them instead of making an extra step, if that makes sense. That's how I would explain it. Ginny, does that resonate with you?
It does, yeah, absolutely. One of the questions I get a lot as a subject matter expert is, so the process I think can appear pretty cumbersome to an applicant. So in order to communicate with me as a subject matter expert, an applicant is required to go through the Flux program. So the milestones and the reports are submitted to the Flux program. I am I've become aware of them after the grants office does their amazing work. And then I issue responses directly to the applicant and the consultant. And then if you want to talk to me again, you're expected to go through the Flux, with the formal discussion. Now, I'm always available for informal discussions with both consultants and applicants, especially about our comments. But I can understand how that might get a little confusing sometimes. The reason why that is because, and Carolyn, correct me if I'm wrong, from my understanding, it is because those formal submissions they ultimately have to meet the grant requirements. All of the content has to meet the State Historic Preservation Office requirements with regard to context, because ultimately we're the keepers of those preservation planning documents. So the communication really goes through the grants office to me or my colleagues and then out to you. And that can get a little complicated. We try to say things like, this looks great. You and I have talked about some wonderful things. Now get it over to grant so that you can check that box so that Carolyn and her team and the money, has all the T's crossed and all the I's dotted. So there are sometimes sort of a double set of rules and understandings that you have to make. One is the grant rules and requirements, and then one is the actual content requirements.
And I think, Ginny, I would just add that the content requirements are part of the grant manual. So it is incorporated into the grant practices that you will meet these standards. And the standards are developed either by the National Park Service or the State Historic Preservation Office in context with the National Park Service, if I'm saying that correctly too, as stuff like that. But we do have to operate as two separate entities because we're not housed together anymore. So and we're working that out. We're working it out, and it works well right now. But there's still some tweaks to it, and I think we try to err on the side of our customers, or our constituents, or our clients, or however you want to, you folks, our applicants, our grantees. We try to err on your side to make it as seamless as possible, but we can't always do that. So
thank you for that. We appreciate your support when it comes to doing these reviews.
Yes, this is great. This is great. Well, thank you for talking a little bit about those two pieces. I think that's really helpful. I think I did see some questions come in. Did our moderator want to read those?
Thanks, Crystal. This is something that I suspected. I am not able to see the questions. I don't know if it's because I've given you the presenter status. I don't see the questions. So you may want to, if you can see them or anyone else can see them, you may want to go ahead and take those and direct them to the person who can ask that. I have a question myself, but if we have some time, but I'll hand it over to you, Crystal, if you could see those questions. Oh, wait, no, yep. I'm sorry. I just saw one. Let's see if it's the same question you can see. The question is, how can someone find out which context studies have already been completed? That's a good question. And where can those studies be accessed?
That is an excellent question. So formal context studies are part of the State Historic Preservation's office's bibliography. So it's a reports database that we have, and we have them housed in physical form and in digital form. The best website, the best email address to use is, oh, help me, Leslie,
Data request.
Data request SHPO at
SHPO,
state.mn.us.
state.mn.us. Yeah, it's on our website.
And I will put that in it is in our website, and I will put that in the chat. Jim Krumrei, my colleague, our colleague there at that deals with those reports can do searches for you. Right now, they're not available for perusal on the website, but we are working diligently towards that, and with the hopes of that being something that's fully accessible to the public in a digital format here pretty soon. COVID has required that our offices remain closed, but as soon as our offices are open, those are also available to peruse in a physical form, when we're able to open up.
I would
Excellent.
just piggyback on that. That'll be more of a complete list of the context study around Minnesota. But if you're looking specifically for legacy funded ones, there is a state website, and I'll put the URL in the chat for folks if they wanted to look at the ones that were funded through the legacy grant dollars. And then I would say the best contact is the grantee. So if you're interested in that kind of context study, we would refer you back to the grantee as your first contact. They're intimately familiar with that document. And then they would also, if there's been changes or revisions to it, they would have those as well. So.
Okay, thank you, Carolyn. I actually can see additional questions. They've been put in the chat. If you can put your questions in Q&A, that would be ideal. But I can see the chat questions. Crystal, do we have some time for additional questions at this point?
Yep, absolutely. We have 6 minutes.
Okay, great. What if a context study and registration requirements don't result in properties expected to be determined eligible, actually being determined eligible? Can it be revised to enhance inclusion of those properties? Is this a red flag for a context study?
So from what I understand, I think the question is if the expectation is a property will be determined eligible and a context study is performed and it turns out that property isn't actually eligible, whether or not that means the context study has failed. And no, the context study has not failed. The point of a context study is to provide that foundational documentation. If a property is flagged as eligible through that study, it keeps coming up over and over again, and it seems to be pretty clear, and a recommendation of that context study is that you move forward with further evaluation, then you can do that. A context study will not give a negative finding generally. It will only give positive findings. So if you find that the property you expect to come up over and over again isn't, it's still okay to do an evaluation specifically on that property. Because remember, history of properties are layers upon layers upon layers of context. So if it's not architecturally significant, maybe it's significant for the civil rights movement or women's history or something vastly different that I can't even contemplate right now. Each of those pieces can be explored individually through individual contexts, or if it doesn't make sense to do a context for a broad swath of properties, we can look directly at a single property and develop all of the context related to that property in order to get an eligibility requirement. So that's what a National Register nomination or a property evaluation will encompass. So we try to be very open-minded about the outcome of a context. We rely on our consultants to provide the best available information, and we accept those general recommendations as we find them. However, sometimes we have that little flag in our head, and we should explore that too, because a person's intuition and understanding of a property is worth following, even if it results in a non-eligible finding. And yes, Maggie let me know that the thing that I posted to everyone was actually incorrect. So I'm going to post again. We are no longer at the Minnesota Historical Society.
Oh, no.
Sorry about that.
We would forward it to you.
Thank you.
One more question. Do context studies expire? How long is a context study typically in place before it needs to be updated?
That's a great question. So a context study does not expire. History is history. However, after about 10 years, sometimes they're a little stale. And generally that's because we have a new understanding of history, and we have a little more perspective on the more recent past. Now, it depends entirely on your type of context. So if you've done one of those broad citywide contexts, it will have a shorter shelf life because, you know, time keeps marching and history keeps changing and we learn new things. A context on mid-century architecture is likely to remain largely the same because once those buildings are in place, they're not likely to change unless we learn something specific about mid-century architecture. So it really sort of depends on your context type, but generally I would say, you know, you may want to revisit those every 5 to 10 years and see whether or not they're still applicable or whether or not we've learned something new.
Thank you, Ginny. Crystal, are we ready to go on to the next presenter?
Yes, I think that would be fantastic. So thank you for those discussions. I think that's really helpful. So we've now wrapped up the first half of our presentation. So we did the definition, scope, and overview. We talked about legacy amendment grant guidance. We had our great Q&A. I will just quickly introduce you to what the Golden Valley Historical Society looks like. This is our building. We do have a museum that opened in 2018. And so we would love to see you. They're open currently only Saturdays from 11 to 3, but we would love to see you there. And now we'll jump into the second half of the presentation, which is about the Golden Valley Historic Context Study. So we'll start off with Teresa Martin, who'll give a nice overview of the project origins, its goals, and we did a nice community event. So Teresa, thank you so much for wanting to present for us today.
Thanks, Crystal. It's great to be here today. And like Carolyn, I wanted to give a shout out to the taxpayers of Minnesota for funding the Legacy Grant Program, because especially for smaller organizations and cities, this has just been a godsend for being able to do these kind of studies that otherwise would have been out of reach financially. There's been so many interesting and insightful projects that have been done even with these $10,000 and under, which is what we did for our context study. So just a shout out and a thank you, and thank you to the staff over at SHPO and the staff managing the grants, Carolyn and Ginny, for keeping these going along, especially during COVID, which had been kind of challenging. So Golden Valley's been very fortunate with these grants. The Historical Society, the picture that Crystal just showed you, Crystal was very instrumental in some of the grants, and actually all of the grants to develop the museum there. It's a small museum that's excellent. So if you're out and about, please do stop by. The context study came about. I was interested in the context study, not knowing I was interested in a context study years ago. You can flip the slide there, Crystal. This is Golden Valley. You can see its proximity to Minneapolis. It's a wonderful place to live. You can jump on these freeways. You're close to the lakes, to Theodore Wirth Park, to 5 minutes from downtown. It's really accessible, and also it's a beautiful community. But you can see that we are diced and sliced by Trunk Highway 169, Trunk Highway 100, 55 goes through the middle of the city. We've got 394 on the southern border. And just a few miles north of Golden Valley, we have 694. So, and we also have railroad line running through the city. And at one point, there was some discussion about light rail coming through Golden Valley. So we've got a lot of large transportation systems, and with the advent of the increased development of condos and apartments too, we've seen a lot of that type of growth in Golden Valley. You can anyway, I drive by this beautiful building just about every day. This is old Jehovah's Witness Kingdom Hall. It's housed by another religious organization right now, but I'd always drive by it and think it was just a super cool building. When a study was done by Gareth Peterson on Douglas Drive, it was identified as being built by, or being designed by architect Herb Fritz, who was a student of Frank Lloyd Wright. A few years ago, after Jehovah's Witness community worshipers, this place became too small for their community, and there was some discussion about tearing it down and building a bigger building. And I was just like heartbroken because it's such an incredibly cool late modernist building, and it sits right there on the corner, a main corner in Golden Valley. So I started thinking about when the city started doing their planning for the 2030 comprehensive plan. I was interested to see what the city might have as far as any kind of historic preservation planning. I knew we had a historical society, but it's not associated with the city. And they've done some great studies in the past, but there was no formal documentation that the city had. There wasn't a document that said, these are the things that we want to think about. These are the historic preservation measures we want to put in place, and these are the buildings we want to look at. There weren't any planning tools and something that could inform the comprehensive plan. You can switch it again. So it had been on my mind, and being in historic preservation as an archaeologist, I don't know a lot about buildings, but I know what I liked. And when the city of Golden Valley rebuilt Brookview Center, they had a nod to mid-century modern. That building is on the right in the picture here. And as part of the celebration of the opening of this new community center, Larry Millett was invited to come to the city and give a presentation. I'm sure many of you know who he is. He wrote Lost Twin Cities. He's an architect, a historian, and an author. At any rate, it was a great presentation, and Larry Millett referred to Golden Valley as the golden arc of mid-century modern. It was a great presentation, really exciting, and I was there with my stepfather, who was an architect. He's 91 now, but it was his firm that helped design the City Hall in Golden Valley, and I think maybe the police building as well. At any rate, he was enjoying a conversation, and we ran into one of the city council members, Larry Faunist, who actually sits on the Golden Valley Historical Society board. And Larry and I got all excited. We were thinking, what can we do? We knew this comprehensive plan was being done. What can we do to examine ways to put historic resources into the equation when the city is doing planning, when development comes to our city, if roads wanted to be widened or if there was a light rail, what can we do? So of course I'm like, we're going to do a study of Tyro Hills, and we're going to look at these buildings, and we're going to see all this National Register. And so fortunately for me, I was working with good friends like Dennis Gimmelstead, some of you may know, and Gareth Peterson, one of our premier historians in the state, and they're looking at me like, Teresa, you need to have a historic context study. You need the foundations for the city. And I'm like, okay. And they were kind enough to point out a few that had been done. First ring suburb studies, Maplewood, I believe, is one of them, and some other first ring studies, cities in the metropolitan area. So there we are. We knew what we needed to do. We needed to set that foundation before we could be doing any evaluation. So could you flip it again? Let's see. So understanding that these context studies can, help with preservation planning for your city. They can inform those comprehensive plans. They can use as planning documents that the city could look at. Let's say they want to expand Highway 100. That happened several years ago when they had to take bridges down, but it would be a document that can help inform decisions for the city. It's a foundation we needed for any neighborhood studies that we might be looking at. And it also is the starting point for identifying places that, especially locally, but also that may have state and national importance. You can flip it again. So Larry and I decided on a plan, and Larry was going to go off and actually talk to Crystal Boyd. And we lovingly refer to Crystal as our velvet hammer because she gets stuff done in a very kind way and moves projects forward. And she recommended doing a presentation to the Golden Valley Historical Society. I had my information in my back pocket, having talked to the historians that I worked with, and some examples of context studies that had been done. So I did a presentation to the Historical Society on the value of these. As a just a citizen in the city, I encourage you, if you have an interest in historic preservation or history, you know, step up. This is, you can do it. And so we did a presentation to the Historical Society, who was very interested in it, and the decision was to apply for a legacy grant. And Crystal really took that by the horns, and we worked together on preparing a legacy grant application. And I was identified in the proposal with some volunteer hours. And Crystal and I talked through what some of those might be: assisting the historian or architectural historian who was hired, perhaps doing an open house for the city, some of those things. So we were fortunate and we got the legacy grant. My role was, Tom Zahn was selected as the historian to conduct the study. And of course, we're right in the middle of COVID. SHPO offices weren't as accessible. I was able to help Tom collect some of the more obscure, not obscure, but less easy to get a hold of documents that were in cultural resources. I took some pictures for Tom, talked to a lot of neighbors and friends about the context study to get some interest going, and then worked with Crystal to host a open house during one of our Market in the Valley events that was actually at the Brooksview Center. During the winter, we had a booth there, and we invited people to come and bring in pieces of history. You can flip it again. And they did. They brought in books and photos and deeds from some of the original farmsteads. It was a lot of fun, and it garnered some interest within the community, which was important. I think, let's see here. So I guess I would encourage folks, if they have an interest in there, is get involved, stick with it. These legacy grants are wonderful. The process is not that difficult. Identify an organization in your community, whether it's your historical society, your city, who may have an interest in this. But now we've got our foundation. We ended up, as an archaeologist and someone who works in tribal affairs, we really wanted the context study to delve back into the massive, to the history, the 13,000 years of history in Minnesota that are prior to the massive pre-European migration into the United States. But we realized with the funding that we had, we would never be able to do justice to that history. So we are working on some other projects to collect oral traditions. We'll be doing something with archaeology in the future that will add to our context. Again, I want to say too that the historic context study was really well received by the city, so much so that they have decided that one of their goals for this year is to explore developing a historic preservation commission, or what it might look like to have someone with a historic preservation background on the planning commission. Just a lot of ideas. So it's moving the needle from nothing to really some really exciting changes in Golden Valley concerning historic preservation. So you can do it as a volunteer. I encourage you to step up and stick with it and get involved. I found it was really very fun, and I learned a lot just working with Crystal and Tom. And I think that's about all I have to offer. I think the last slide is, I think, oh, it's just a dog, because I always have to put a dog in anything I do, because it's important. She's sitting outside the door right now, scratching on it. So that's awesome. If anybody has any questions about the role of a volunteer, feel free to
Yeah.
stick something in the chat or.
Yes,
Thank you.
absolutely. This is great. Thank you, Teresa. And that's right. Yeah, if you have questions, please feel free to type them in the chat. Teresa has been a major promoter and booster for this project, both the historic context study and the follow-ups that will spin off from that and grow to have their own lives. So we've been so fortunate to have you, Teresa. Thank you so much for all you've done.
Thank you, Crystal. It's a pleasure
It's
working
been-
with you in the city.
Absolutely, absolutely. Likewise.
Thank you.
And so this leads us right into the next piece about project implementation. So the Golden Valley Historical Society is an all-volunteer group. They don't have any staff, they're just all volunteers. And to do this project right, we released a request for proposals. We got our bids back and selected a contractor who is Tom Zahn. So Tom will speak about the project implementation piece. Tom, we'd love to have you introduce yourself and run through your slides.
Okay, Tom Zahn here, and I have a firm in St. Paul, Minnesota. I've been in the business of an independent historical architecture business for over 35 years now. And before that, I was the preservation planner for the city of St. Paul, which sort of brought me into preservation from just being a regular architect. So anyway, I want to focus a little bit on Golden Valley, but basically talk about the major steps we go through as consultants and the products you might find within a context study that are both related to National Register designation or evaluation and to historical components of your community. So if we could add the next slide. This sort of answers a little bit of a question before about the names of some of the context studies in the state. We've done quite a few, and the term context studies as it was presented initially by Crystals wouldn't necessarily apply to some of the earlier context studies. In 1990, I was hired by the city of Minneapolis to help them work on their preservation plan and develop context or themes for further study. And we developed a context for or theme for the railroad for their preservation plan in 1990. That was my first experience. That was relatively quickly after I left the city of St. Paul and started my own business. And then I had a job in Faribault, which was pretty extensive variety of preservation jobs, including National Register nominations of stone houses, design guidelines for the downtown. They had a contextual evaluation done a few years earlier, and they wanted that revised. So that's how I got involved in a contextual evaluation process. And then in 2003, Lake City was our first city where we just went in and we did pretty much a comprehensive study of their community and put together one of the earlier context studies of, and I don't know if those are all in the file, but I can add those to the file, Chippo. So anyway, Lake City, Chaska, Waseca, Mankato, were all cities that had heritage preservation commissions. They were looking for a systematic approach at identifying their historic properties and resources. And the context studies were similar as far as scope. They dealt with a number of different themes, and I'll talk about that in a little bit later. Maplewood was our first context study that was done for a first-ring suburb. There was kind of a beauty to it in the sense that we didn't have to travel very far, coming from St. Paul to Maplewood to do the groundwork. And we were quite surprised at the amount of historic context that we found, or historic significance we found in the city of Maplewood. We weren't expecting it. We weren't sure what we were going to get, but we I think we did a pretty good job for them and gave them some direction, the Heritage Preservation Commission, some direction on where to go with that. North Mankato was funded by the city, not a CLG grant, but by the city. And they were interested in demonstrating that city government was interested in historic preservation to their community. So it had a little different focus, but it did lead to a series of plaques being put up in front of historic brick structures in the community, and will probably lead to eventually the establishment of a Heritage Preservation Commission. They did not have one. And then Golden Valley was a legacy grant, which was a pretty big project as it turned out. And I think we created a really wonderful document. It had some wonderful twists and turns in our process and discoveries in the beautiful archive collection they have at the museum and Crystal manages. And I think it was just a really wonderful document, wonderful experience for us to go into Golden Valley, and also opened us up to some interpretation of mid-century modern architecture. And I'm presently working on Columbia Heights. So Golden Valley led to Columbia Heights, and it's a very different worker community, worker housing community, basically, and it's been somewhat of a challenge. So moving on, next slide. The basic process components that we have from a consulting perspective is a study methodology and research design report, which I'll go into in the next slide. But and then thematic development, we used to call them contexts, like railroad contexts or transportation contexts. Now they're called themes, or we put them in as chapters in our reports. We do drafts of the report and send them back to the client, the city, and those are reviewed by the city and by the legacy people and SHPO, or preservation office people as well. And then the final report is produced, and we have contracted deliverables that we also provide, which I'll talk to in just a little bit. So next slide. The research design is really an important factor in the process. It really makes the consultant focus on how they're going to, or bring the project into focus on how they're going to go about collecting information, what they anticipate the guiding questions will be, like, are there collections of, how do we anticipate finding collections of mid-century modern concentrations? Do we, what remains of original downtowns or original commercial centers and that sort of thing. So we begin to anticipate the chapters and the time parameters and resources, and make suggestions on where we think those are going to be and what they're going to be, and then and put together a potential bibliography with a pretty much a first run through it, trying to figure out where we're going to go with this, and then what appendices. We generally have standard appendices with the reports. So next. So the thematic development or the chapter development is done by touring the study area. We generally try to hit most of the streets, just to give a windshield survey, to make a determination if we see anything that stands out. If we see concentrations of historic looking buildings, or if we find interesting architecture, that sort of thing. We pretty much locate a lot of it in that first sort of drive through of the community. Then we begin writing the physical research and potential historic resources, and that's pretty self-explanatory. We're going around to the various archives. In the case of Golden Valley, it wasn't that difficult because so much of it was already focused in the archives at the Golden Valley Historical Society Museum and building there. And then we do begin photography. I've done professional photography work in the past, so I may do a little more photography than most for my reports, but I take pride in my photography, and so we do a lot of photographing of buildings, especially styles of houses and all the major buildings we talk about in the report. And then we determine a listing of the themes and address them in the study. In the next slide, I think you'll find this is a pretty typical theme list. We don't get too much, we haven't gotten too much into Native American prehistory. And so basically we generally start out at early settlement. Agriculture and farming is generally big. Even in Maplewood, we found a farm that was still functioning. So there were some wonderful finds there. And then transportation, which deals with early roads, in some cases, early trails where people were going through the woods to get to the lake or the river, and right through to rails and highways. And then the rest of them are pretty self-explanatory: social, cultural, and religious activities. We do try to include churches in the reports that have architectural significance or historical significance, like the church that the Historical Society is in is like the oldest church in Golden Valley. It's been moved early on, but it's a really early church. So that would be based, the religious significance of that would be based, or the religious activities would be based on the age of the church and the role it played in an original meeting place for the community and that sort of thing. Parks and Rec, parks were really important in the Golden Valley report because we have Theodore Wirth Park partially in Golden Valley, and there were many, well, I shouldn't say many, but there were quite a few resources such as the Chalet building. We found the last remaining streetcar station in the metro area is in the park and in Golden Valley. There are a number of bridges that had formerly been surveyed, stone bridges, WPA work. So parks became very important in our report to Golden Valley.
Mm-hmm. And Tom, I would just mention real quick, I think we've got 2 more minutes. I think you've only got 3 minutes left, so you're doing good.
Okay, okay. Well, let's go to the next slide. We do National Register evaluations and recommendations. In the case of Golden Valley, we were making recommendations on the Mission Church, Theodore Wirth Park, the Chalet. There were a number of residential groupings like South Tyrol Hills, which was this incredible collection of 1920s, 1930s revival style houses that were built. There were 18 of them. They were listed in a wonderful document we found in the collection, which was at the museum, which was a 1939 atlas, I think, is that correct? 1939 atlas that had every quarter. It was a WPA project that had every quarter of the of Golden Valley in it, with every house, every barn, every fence, every brick stone wall, it was just amazing. It was an amazing tool to find this beautiful snapshot of what Golden Valley looked like right before the big the influx of suburban development or platting for individual property lots. So there was some of that going on in the eastern portion at that point in time. I think we could just go on. This just basically, we have a brief history and maps and so forth, and you can certainly follow up on any. I have some context studies which you can reach on my site. You can certainly get them to the Historical Society or to the Preservation Office. The deliverables also include a PDF, which we encourage to be put on to the municipal website. So everybody has access to it. I assume, Crystal, that that's been done. Okay, so is that with the city or with the Historical Society?
Yeah, we have it posted a couple places. It's both on the Golden Valley Historical Society website, and I think the city can link to that page. So people should be able to get it a couple different ways.
Thank you, PDF files. It's a wonderful thing to be able to get things out without everybody having to have a paper copy. But we also, if there are digital files of photographs that are used in the report, and we label them and submit them with the deliverables, and a number of hard copies of the final report go to the client. And then we make a final presentation of the full report in this case, we did it over Zoom, but it was done to the Historical Society board. Next slide. Yeah, my professional involvement in context studies has a because of my background working as a planner for the Heritage Preservation Commission in St. Paul and the community, we have a real community kind of focus, hoping to keep to meet the needs of the community and the awareness and support, and also follow the guidelines that Ginny put out with regards to the National Register nomination. So that said, we are up to here in context study right now with Columbia Heights. So anyway, any questions you have, throw them my way, and I'll give you the best answers I can. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Tom. And I do also want to give you a big thank you for working through the pandemic. You mentioned a couple twists and turns in our project, and the pandemic was definitely one of them. So you and your team did an amazing job, and we were really grateful that we could continue working even through those challenges.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, so this is fantastic, and it leads us to the last piece. You've all set this up perfectly to talk about some of the project outcomes and legacy. So this is a brief overview of some of the end products that we received and the Golden Valley Historical Society was very proud of. So as Tom mentioned, there is a research design that happens as the first milestone if you have legacy amendment funding. So Tom wrote the research design that goes through it's called the Flux system. It goes into the grant portal so the grant staff and SHPO can review. So our research design was 40 pages. And then once that's approved, or if you work with SHPO to tweak it a little bit, then you can get started writing that historic context study. And in the end, ours was 102 pages. I have to admit, this was much longer than I might have anticipated. It's fabulous, and it's almost like a small book in itself. So if you're getting ready for one of these, take a look at the scope of what you're doing and plan ahead for what the effort that might take. And Tom, as he mentioned, takes some beautiful photos. So the Golden Valley Historical Society was very lucky that in addition to the historic context study, we also have digital copies of these great photos that he took. And so here are, 3 photos of houses in Golden Valley, different architectural styles, but he also does photos of places of business, like this glass. It used to be a bank building on the top, and it's been repurposed as a lighting store in Golden Valley. I think that's a great reuse of a mostly glass building, or churches and other places that are significant but not residential. So we have those sort of as a separate add-on that have been really useful. As Teresa mentioned, we also did a community outreach event, and we asked the public to come and visit and talk to us about the project, and also bring in things they might like to donate to the Golden Valley Historical Society. And so we had at least 7 offers of collection donations, and that is really pretty good for just a couple hours at the local farmers market. We got to make a lot of connections and talk to the community, so that was great. When the project was all finished, there was actually a whole bundle of activity, a flurry of activity that happened right at the end so we could promote our end product. And I'll talk about that a little more in a minute, but we really tried to distribute it through many different channels. So we pushed out that final product through at least 11 different distribution channels. And the project didn't end here. It inspired other projects that will go on to grow and expand upon this baseline product. So we have at least 4 projects that are either funded or in the process of thinking about being funded. So I'm going to run through this project distribution really quickly, and I'm happy to answer any questions about it. But this is just a quick overview of what might happen when you finish your project. So we have this beautiful study. It's all finished. We put a hard copy in the Golden Valley Historical Society archives. So this is a photo of our archives. We've got one in there so that it will always be preserved and people can see it in the future. We have a great volunteer who's fantastic with media and press releases. So he wrote a press release that got pushed out to the world. And we also distributed our good news through social media. So we put it on our Facebook page. And as we go through this, you might start to see that we use the cover, that front image, a lot. So I know it can seem like a small thing, but Tom does such a beautiful cover that might be really helpful to you in the future. You're going to use that imagery a lot when you're promoting your end product. We also put it in our newsletter. We put it on the website. So here it is on the website. We've got the Legacy logo, the Historical Society logo, and that cover page again. And promoted it through our newsletter. So this was accompanied by a nice article talking about the study and what it accomplished. And typically we would also invite Tom to give a public presentation. Once a month, we talk to the public about what the Historical Society is doing. It didn't happen because of COVID, but we were able to do a short presentation by Zoom, and that was good for the board. Speaking of the board, in order to keep them involved with the project and really recognize the final product, we printed hard copies of that final document. And so I don't know if folks can see me, but we have hard copies and gave one to every board member. And I know that's a little bit of an extra or a bonus, but I think it really helped them connect with the project and get excited about it, because it's a lot to look at 102 pages of a PDF. But if you can flip through it on your own time, I think people connect with it really well. We did the same thing for the city mayor and city council members. We gave them hard copies of this end document so that they could reference it and use it in the future. And that also helped to establish some relationships between the Golden Valley Historical Society and the city. We're a separate standalone nonprofit, but we do work with the city and help inform some of their work. And this helped to strengthen that relationship. And we also gave a hard copy to the State Historic Preservation Office. That's one of the deliverable requirements in the Legacy Amendment Grant. So I think Teresa either dropped it off or mailed it over there because of COVID. So we did get one over to SHPO. A couple other things. So those were the things we did, but other people picked up our study and started to promote it for us as well. So there's the local cable news channel, CCX Media, picked it up and started to tell people about it. And the city of Golden Valley featured it on its website. So that helps to link back to our page and start to make connections in the community. So we did a lot to distribute this and get it out to the public. And from all that good work, we've gone on to have some great outcomes and inspire other actions. The Golden Valley City Council voted to take one of their 2021 action steps. They vote on 5 priorities for the year. And one of them for 2021 was to explore what it would take to establish a Heritage Preservation Commission. So they're in the middle of this right now. They've seen this great history. They know Golden Valley has some interesting architecture and interesting past history. What would it take to put together an HPC? So they're looking into that right now. And we think that's a major accomplishment to get that on the city's agenda. The Golden Valley Historical Society itself has a couple projects that they're thinking about. They just recently were notified that they were awarded another legacy amendment to research Native American, African American, and Asian American resources in their archives. So they've cataloged their archives, but now they're going to dive deeper to highlight some of those stories that haven't been highlighted or tagged in the past. And the Native American piece was called out as a specific recommended action item in the historic context study. So Tom recommended, hey, you've got some great resources, but you could go further. And this project will help to accomplish that. Likewise, Tom recommended that we digitize some of these great resources in the archives. Here's a copy of the 1939 Atlas. And it doesn't quite do it justice. This atlas is huge. I mean, it's, I don't know, I should measure it, but it's gigantic, several feet long. You have to carry it with both hands and open it up and lay it on the floor. So we'd really like to get that digitized. And we also have a Native American trails map. A lot of the roads in Golden Valley follow what used to be Native American trails. If we could get that digitized, we could do some better research and share it more easily. So those are things happening at the Historical Society. We've also inspired one of the local churches, Valley Community Presbyterian Church. The church on its own was writing a land acknowledgement statement, but with some of the information we've pulled together and the enthusiasm we have from this study, they've decided to go further and do a Native American oral history project. They'd like to talk to Dakota or Ojibwe people in the area about their connections to Bassett Creek or the area in Golden Valley. So this can help us to inform perhaps another historic context study, one pre-1852. So we can start to look at that prehistory and that archaeology that Teresa was talking about. And then we'd have a more complete picture of Golden Valley and really do justice to that early part of our history. So a lot of exciting things happening. These are some other things that came out of the study. So recommendations about buildings that could be evaluated. I have to admit, I'm not super strong in preservation planning, so I might get some of these words wrong, but we have at least 7 places that could be evaluated for National Register of Historic Places nominations. So 5 that could be at the national level, or sorry, 7 at the national level, including this is the chalet at Theodore Wirth Park. There's also 5 local places, might have local recommendations, and then a lot of other recommendations and future actions that aren't tied to building listings, but would still be very helpful for the city to think about when they're doing preservation planning. And so I'll also mention a few successes and lessons learned, but I hope that you folks are throwing some questions in the chat. So I'll go through these really quickly. We learned that it takes a team to do a historic context study, from the State Historic Preservation Office to the Minnesota Historical Society and its grants staff, the local organization that you're working with, like the Golden Valley Historical Society, great volunteers like Teresa who keep that enthusiasm going, perhaps a project manager, that was the role that I played, and then hiring a professional contractor if you don't have that experience in-house. So there's a lot of great folks coming together to create a great product. In the format that we did it, we learned that it costs more than $10,000. So I think you could do it for a small grant for $10,000 or less, but be very specific about what you're doing. And it would probably be just a research report, not the surveys and not the photographs that Tom added as a bonus. So we were very lucky to get that. If you're looking for some of those add-ons, you might think about doing a large grant, and those come around once a year. The small grants are 4 times a year. The large grant is once a year. We had a really good time pulling it together. If I did it again, I would recommend starting the document in Microsoft Word. We used InDesign so we could get all those photos in a great place, but it makes it really hard to go back and edit later. So if I did it again, I would recommend type it up in Word. When you're ready to do that formatting, maybe then shift it over to InDesign, and that would save a lot of time. Another thing I didn't think about beforehand was that we might really like to have specific footnotes. So if you're quoting something or information comes from kind of an obscure place, have that little footnote right on the page. We have a general bibliography, but that makes it hard to find where did that one piece of information come from. We really want to know where each of those pieces are for future research. We had a great community event. Like I mentioned, we had, I think, 7 donations as a result of that event, but it takes a lot of time to process those, especially if you're an all-volunteer group. So maybe think about the time that goes into that, or budget in some costs to pay a professional to help you process those. And we had a great project. I would say celebrate your successes because the community wants to hear about it. They're so hungry for this information, and they will really respond enthusiastically. And so with that, I think we're ready to open up for final questions. And yeah, we would love to know, what are you interested in? Is anyone out there thinking about doing a historic context study? What would you like to know?
Crystal, can I say really quickly, I am really excited about your next steps, and I want to encourage anyone who's listening to make sure that they reach out to the community that is being affected and discussed by the context. I saw that your next steps with Golden Valley and the Valley Community Presbyterian Church are both interested in specifically Native American contextual development, and I love the idea that you're going to engage with those communities. So remember that if you're working with underrepresented communities, remember to maybe engage with them early and maybe let them lead. I think that that's going to be really, really important when you're talking about context, and you're going to get the best possible product if those people and those communities that are at the center of that contextual development are the ones leading that context. So thank you so much for that hard work. That's really, really exciting.
Absolutely.
I'm hoping to
Yes,
see
and
it. So thanks for
if
letting me jump in, and now I'll mute.
I'm sorry, Ginny. If other folks are heading that direction and starting to think about Native American projects or others, I'm learning a lot about the resources that are out there. There's a listserv through the University of Minnesota that is fantastic. And so if people have questions about those next steps, I'm happy to chat about those too. So maybe to our anything in the chat?
Yeah, there are some questions in the Q&A section. Here's an interesting one. And first of all, just a nice compliment from Erin. Great presentation, and thank you to the presenters. Here's a question. In repurposing a building, does anyone have comments regarding art, pipe organs, etc., which the building may contain and which may not be easily removable?
Not from my end.
I know there are professionals that deal specifically with what historic preservation professionals consider furniture, like an organ. Generally, we consider that part of the building. If it can be removed, there are great ways to do it. But I am not the person to advise you. I encourage you to go to maybe the Minnesota Historical Society's Preservation Specialist Directory to look for professionals that are specifically attuned, for lack of a better word, and sorry for the pun, to organs.
I think, yeah, I can put the preservation directory in the chat, so there's a link to that. I guess a conversation with the design reviewer probably would be the most appropriate, either with the SHPO office or the Minnesota Historical Society has design reviewers as well. So I think that would be a question for them.
Yeah, that sounds good. Thank you, Ginny and Carolyn. We have about 3 minutes. If you do have a quick question, please put it in the Q&A section of that function. I'm not seeing any pop up here. I do have a question for Ginny. We've talked about wanting to see more context studies for underrepresented communities, underrepresented places. If you had a personal wish list, what might that include? Are there certain communities or certain types, property types that you think haven't been represented well?
I think we have a number of communities specifically that are underrepresented in the National Register, and certainly I think in local designation as well, although I'm not quite as familiar with that. A lot of that are, as Crystal pointed out, the work Golden Valley is doing with the African American community, the LGBTQT community, any BIPOC communities, civil rights discussions, things like that, things that are not necessarily new to our history, but certainly we are becoming more aware of it and their impacts on the built environment specifically. Native American and archaeological survey and context development are always in great need. As Leslie, you pointed out before, those 13,000 years of history are not as well understood as those things that we can see simply because of the nature of history and those people controlling those histories for the past. So my wish list has a lot to do with properties eligible under criterion A, and that have to do with that sort of the historical understanding and significance of our built environment. I do have a soft spot for modernism. I'm going to say I have a soft spot for postmodernism. I think we really need to understand brutalism better. I know that that's going to make some people cringe, but we're marching headlong into, we're in the 1970s and we're coming up on the 1980s, and it'd be great to know those things before we start, affecting them with our projects. So I want all the things all the time, Leslie.
Thanks, Ginny. One quick question also. There was a question about, does the SHPO have a list of informal historic contexts that have been developed for architectural and history surveys and included in survey reports?
So yes, that's an excellent question. I think what the participant is asking about regarding informal surveys or informal contexts are those not completed as standalone contexts, which is what we have been discussing in general. Contexts are also completed as part of survey and identification and evaluation. That works the opposite way, right? These contexts are talking about geographic and temporal limits where you find a building. Informal contexts, I guess, as we're referring to them in this conversation, happen the opposite way, where you have a building or a geographic space and you're looking up and out in order to develop, in order to evaluate. Those things right now at the State Historic Preservation Office are not keyword searchable. That's part of our digitization effort, and we hope that once we have digitized reports, you can come in and search modern, or you can come in and search A-frame, things like that. Right now, the best way to locate those is to find a comparable property, either geographically or stylistically or thematically, and speak to send that request to data request SHPO. The information you get back has associated reports, and that's a way you can get there. With regard to research, you can also contact SHPO and discuss with us what we are familiar with, and we'll run through the same sort of a research process where we take what we know and try to look for things that are similar, and then you would explore the bibliography, either the reports bibliography that's the official kind of access database that we have, or the literal bibliography of a report you find, and look for things that are applicable. It's a little bit cumbersome and we're working on that, but that right now is sort of the old school research way you would locate those informal contexts.
Thank you, Ginny, and thanks very much to all of our presenters. This was really well organized and wonderfully done. Lots of really good information. We're at time. Does any one of our presenters have a closing statement that you'd like to make? Or have we wrapped it up? We wrapped it up.
Wrapped it up. Like you said, just
Okay.
a huge thank you to all the people it takes to put this together. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Crystal, and thank you to all of the presenters. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.